Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to 20th Century Revolutions. Episode 2.27, The Action Army. Quick shout out today to Patreon subscriber Lee Hungry Oswald. Is that really your name, or is that you, Alex? Either way, thank you so much for your ongoing support of the show. Your donations really help keep this thing chugging along, and I sure do appreciate it. All right, I know, longer break than anticipated, but same old story. Toddler plus busy with work equals not enough time in the day to record, but we are back, so let's go on and get into it. In the days immediately following the counter-revolution of 1909, the 31 March incident, as it would come to be called, a dark and foreboding atmosphere gripped the Ottoman imperial capital of Istanbul. As armed religious students and reactionary soldiers roamed the streets, government ministers and parliamentary deputies associated with the Committee of Union and Progress had been forced to go underground, either hiding in the homes of friends and relatives in the city, or, if they were lucky, managing to escape the capital altogether. The insurrection of April the 13th had left Istanbul in a state of political limbo, because large segments of the First Army had been the initial instigators of the mutiny that had launched the counter-revolution, creating a situation in which it was quite difficult to know who exactly was now in charge of maintaining law and order. And it was rumored that the inflammatory Naqshbandi Sheikh Dervish Vadeti, leader of the populist and proto-Islamist group the Muslim Union, was now the one running the show. For the residents of Istanbul, most of whom had hidden themselves away in their homes, one of the most common sights had become that of army deserters with rifles slung over their shoulders and softa religious students carrying a Quran in one hand and a large club in the other, patrolling the streets and hunting down the enemies of the Sultan and of traditional Islam. As these mutinous soldiers and reactionary students roamed the capital, they sacked the headquarters of progressive and unionist newspapers, including the recently founded CUP-aligned paper Tanin, as well as Ahmed Reza's long-running paper Council of the Islamic Community. The soldiers and students also hunted down prominent CUP members, and in the end they would lynch over 20 unionists. The sight of armed softas and soldiers roaming the streets with guns, clubs, and swords was especially alarming for ethnic and religious minorities, who had lived through the dark days of the 1895 Hamidian massacres, which had begun with very similar scenes. The reactionary turn was also alarming for Ottoman feminists, who now wondered what exactly the full reinstatement of Sharia law would mean for them. The liberalism of the past several months had created an atmosphere in which ethnic minorities and women had felt newly emboldened to participate openly in the public sphere, as they formed political clubs and parties, published newspapers and journals, and demonstrated in the city streets. But this new visibility of women and religious minorities had been one of the primary causes of the rise in reactionary religious politics in the capital. And now it seemed to everyone in Istanbul that the revolution had all but failed, that sultanic autocracy and religious conservatism had returned, and now in a more vengeful form. Amidst the insurrectionary chaos of April the 13th, the vice president of the Chamber of Deputies and emerging leader of the CUP's Sacred Committee, Mehmet Talat, had escaped the reactionary mob and found refuge in the home of a leading Armenian dashnak by the name of I Akuni. And after spending several days in hiding with his Armenian friend and comrade, Talat, the future genocidaire, escaped the city center and slipped out to the suburb of San Stefano. After arriving in San Stefano, Talat would begin the process of forming a counter-government that he would lead and that he would eventually dub the National Assembly, likely in a self-conscious reference to his heroes from the French Revolution. Talat would be joined in San Stefano by around 100 deputies, or roughly one-third of the Ottoman parliament. And these deputies in Talat's National Assembly represented the portion of the parliament generally aligned with the CUP. While Talat was putting together this CUP-dominated National Assembly in San Stefano, the Albanian leader Ismail Kemal simultaneously gathered as many deputies as he could muster in the parliament building at Siragan Palace on the European shore of the Bosphorus, right in the heart of Istanbul. Ismail Kemal, future founding father of Albania, had emerged in parliament as one of the principal leaders of the Liberty Party, alongside the Sultan's reformist nephew, Prince Sabahaddin. As we mentioned last week, there is a lot of evidence that the Liberty Party actually played a pretty significant role in initiating the counter-revolution of April 1909, which culminated in the 31 March incident. And by the way, in case you were wondering, this event is called the 31 March incident because the mutiny in the First Army against Mektebli officers and the subsequent demonstration of soldiers and religious students occurred on 31 March 1325 on the Rumi calendar. But this Rumi date aligns with April the 13th, 1909 on the Gregorian calendar, which we have obviously been using. So it's called the 31 March incident, but all of this happened in mid to late April according to our dating. But anyways, as I was saying, Ismail Kemal gathered as many deputies as he could at the parliament building in the days following the insurrection. And though Ismail Kemal himself likely did not play a role in the counter-revolution, the prominent Dutch Turkologist E.J. Zurcher makes a pretty compelling case for the involvement of Liberty Party deputies in sparking the insurrection. The primary evidence for this is the fact that the mob selectively targeted CUP deputies and left the liberal deputies aligned with the Liberty Party alone. This is, in fact, likely why Ismail Kemal was able to gather a group of liberal parliamentarians in the city center, while armed religious students and reactionary soldiers roamed the streets of Istanbul. But we need to be clear here that the Liberty Party did not support a reactionary agenda. And in fact, most Liberty Party deputies were liberals who supported the Constitution, but who opposed the centralizing policies of the CUP. So, Liberty Party deputies likely assumed that they would be able to harness the unrest among soldiers and religious students to dethrone the CUP. Meaning that Ismail Kemal and his fellow liberal deputies would try to steer the counter-revolution in an exclusively anti-unionist direction. However, they failed miserably in this endeavor, and the reactionary mob under Dervish Vahdeti took on a life of its own, and the demands of the demonstrators increasingly became centered on, number one, restoring the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid, and number two, restoring traditional Sharia Islamic law. The Liberty Party had badly overestimated their ability to steer the direction of the insurrection. And so, Ismail Kemal had no choice but to agree to the demands of these soldiers and students. So, after Ismail Kemal was elected as the new president of this rump Chamber of Deputies, the chamber announced that Sharia law would remain in full effect, and that the chamber would recognize a new government to be selected by Sultan Abdul Hamid. Abdul Hamid then promptly put together a new cabinet. Though it is important to note that this cabinet was not made up of a bunch of Hamidian reactionaries, and instead, the cabinet was filled with mostly non-partisan deputies, as the new Grand Vizier, Ahmed Tevfik, wished more than anything else to control the chaos that had erupted in Istanbul, and to prevent it from devolving into a large anti-Christian or anti-Jewish pogrom, or even into a full-blown civil war. Because at this point, both were very real possibilities. After the formation of this new government and the election of Ismail Kemal as the new president of the Chamber of Deputies, The counter-government in San Stefano under Talat declared this new administration as illegal. And what is interesting about this standoff between Talat and Ismail Kemal is that these two rival governments represented, on the one hand, the CUP, and on the other, the Liberty Party. Both of these parties were liberal and constitutionalist, and neither was reactionary or conservative. The CUP supported a constitutional regime in which political union and centralization of government would be deployed to strengthen the state against foreign incursion. The Liberty Party supported a constitutional regime in which local autonomy and decentralization would be prioritized in order to cultivate the loyalty of the many different diverse elements of the empire, such as Turks, Arabs, Albanians, Armenians, Kurds, Greeks, etc. What this means is that neither of these rival governments was pushing a reactionary or Islamist agenda, even though the counter-revolution had largely been launched in the name of sultanic autocracy and the return of traditional Sharia law. Instead, the two opposed camps in many ways represented the opposing viewpoints within the larger project of Ottomanism, and amongst the group we would typically call the Young Turks. What reveals this most clearly is the fact that Ismail Kemal was replacing Ahmed Reza as the president of the Chamber of Deputies. You may remember that Ismail Kemal and Ahmed Reza had been two of the primary ideological opponents at the First Congress of the Ottoman opposition way back in 1902, when the Young Turks in exile were at the height of their intellectual emigre bickering over foreign intervention. So, even though the insurrection of spring 1909 had been launched by mutinous soldiers and Softa religious students under the leadership of the reactionary Dervish Vadeti, the two groups most well-positioned to take control of the chaotic situation in the capital were the two opposing camps of the Young Turks, the groups we can roughly label as the liberals under Ismail Kemal and the unionists under Talat. In the end, the Unionists would prove to be in a much more advantageous position than the Liberals. This would come down to the fact that the CUP had, over the past year, grown to be incredibly influential in the European lands of the Ottoman Empire, especially amongst the soldiers in the Second and Third Armies. As we talked about in episode 2.23, the Young Turk Revolution, the CUP had succeeded in forcing the Sultan to reinstate the Midhat Constitution because they had so fully infiltrated the ranks of the Third Army of Macedonia. And in the wake of the Revolution of July 1908, the CUP had established de facto control over nearly the entire Ottoman Balkans, and the CUP was able to do this in large part because the population of Ottoman Europe came to see the CUP as essentially the only organization capable of defending Ottoman lands against foreign encroachment and European imperial domination. And through the persistence of CUP propaganda, there had grown a pretty widespread belief throughout Ottoman Europe that the Constitution itself was the single most important element in unifying and strengthening the empire. So, as news of the counter-revolution over in Istanbul made its way to the Sacred Committee of the CUP in Salonica, Unionists quickly began to organize their forces in Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, and Kosovo, and the vast network of CUP agents in the Balkans alerted the population that the Constitution was under imminent threat. And on April the 15th, just 2 days after the insurrection in the imperial capital, the Sacred Committee of the CUP in Salonica began organizing a military force with the express purpose of marching on Istanbul. In their effort to organize this force, capable of putting down the counter-revolution, the CUP would approach the commander of the Third Army of Macedonia, and they would ask him to help them save the Constitution. This commander of the Third Army accepted the offer of the Unionists and decided to temporarily align his entire army with the interests of the CUP. And we are, of course, now talking about Commander Mahmud Shevket Pasha, who is really super duper important and who we will now finally get to fully introduce. General Mahmud Shevket was born in 1856 in Baghdad as the son of an influential Ottoman statesman who served as the governor of Basra, a city on the Persian Gulf in modern-day Iraq. Like many Sunni Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, Mahmud Shevket came from a mixed ethnic heritage, with his father likely being of Georgian descent, his family originally coming from the Russian Caucasus, and his mother was of Arab origin. Mahmud Shevket was of an older generation than the young Turk CUP officers such as Enver, Cemal, Niyazi, and Mustafa Kemal. However, Shevket shared their background within elite military academies. Like his younger colleagues amongst the educated Mektebli officers who would support the CUP in 1908, Shevket had also been schooled in fancy new Prussian military tactics, and Shevket had even worked as an assistant for the German Field Marshal Friar von der Goltz. Now, we are going to continue talking more about this, likely when we get closer to World War I, when the Ottoman-German alliance becomes more and more important. But the Ottomans had been working off and on with the Germans for decades at this point, as Sultan Abdulhamid had asked the Germans to help him modernize the Ottoman military right after the disastrous defeat in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. And, well, von der Goltz had been the German officer sent to the Ottoman Empire to help modernize their army. And Field Marshal von der Goltz became so enmeshed within Ottoman military life that he garnered the nickname Goltz Pasha. Yeah, it's always kind of funny when Westerners are dubbed Pasha. Came across one British guy the other day named Charles Gordon Pasha. Just kind of funny. But anyways, Goltz Pasha kind of became a rock star within the Ottoman military, garnering a cult-like following amongst younger reform-minded officers, amongst people like Mahmud Shevket. These young officers in training would rush to attend the German field marshal's lectures, and many young officers came to see Goltz Pasha as a father-like or even godlike figure. This phenomenon was in fact so widespread within the elite military academies that people began referring to the Ottoman officers graduating in the late 1800s as the Goltz generation. This Goltz generation of officers, of which Mahmud Shevket was a prototypical example, would be distinguished by their commitment to modernizing the Ottoman army along German lines, employing cutting-edge military strategies, integrating modern weaponry, and enforcing strict Prussian discipline. And perhaps most importantly for the development of future events, von der Goltz indoctrinated an entire generation of Ottoman officers in his pet theory, a nation in arms. Von der Goltz had been one of the earliest European military theorists to popularize the idea that a new age of warfare had emerged in which the state would have to mobilize the entirety of the nation's resources and the entirety of the population in order to wage a total war against the nation's many enemies. Goltz Pasha would write down all of these novel ideas down in his book called The Nation in Arms, which would become a military classic. Of course, the popularization of these sorts of ideas arguing for the necessity that nations engage in total war with one another would become pretty important as Europe moves towards 1914. But for the Ottoman military specifically, the so-called Goltz generation, of which Mahmud Shevket was a part, would, generally speaking, come to believe in this idea that a true nation had to be a nation in arms. Or, put another way, the Goltz generation supported the idea that the military was the key institution in driving modernization and national renewal, and that broader society should probably be modeled off of the military. After graduating from military college and studying under Goltz Pasha, Mahmud Shevket would himself write a lot of military treatises, many of which pushed for the integration of the German Mauser rifle in the Ottoman army. So, even though Goltz Pasha would leave his post in the Ottoman military in the mid-1890s, his ideas would be carried on by his Ottoman disciples, by officers like Mahmud Shevket. And the Goltz generation would heavily influence the generation who came after them, the generation who would lead the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. So, Enver, Cemal, Niyazi, Mustafa Kemal, and other Mektebli officers received a healthy dose of Goltz Pasha's nation in arms ideology while in school. And the Young Turk officers who mutinied in 1908 shared a common way of thinking with the older Mahmud Shevket, a way of thinking heavily influenced by German modernization and militarization. Mahmud Shevket would begin to interact more directly with the CUP in 1905, when he was appointed the governor of Kosovo, because Kosovo was at that point becoming a hotbed of CUP conspiracy. And though Mahmud Shevket never became a full member, he did turn a blind eye to the CUP's conspiratorial and seditious activities. And this is why, following the July 1908 revolution, when the CUP began directing Ottoman politics from behind the scenes, Mahmud Shevket would be appointed as the commander of the all-important Third Army of Macedonia. Shevket may not have been a member of the CUP, but the Unionists still tended to think of him as their man. And this is why, in mid-April 1909, when CUP rule was under threat amidst the counter-revolution of the 31 March incident, the Sacred Committee turned to Mahmud Shevket to help them save the Constitution. Mahmud Shevket would accept this offer, and he would throw himself fully into the task of organizing an army that could march against the reactionaries in Istanbul. This force would come to be known as Hareket Ordusu, or the Action Army. When Mahmud Shevket issued a call for his comrades in the Third Army to join him, a large number of staff officers stationed in Macedonia would follow the lead of their commander, and these officers began to gather in Salonica, bringing entire army divisions along with them. One of these officers who would answer Mahmud Shevket's call to arms was the Albanian hero of liberty, Ahmed Niyazi, who would arrive in Salonica with nearly 2,000 soldiers. And then, most importantly perhaps, Ahmed Niyazi would also bring his lucky deer along with him. Yes, you heard that right. Ahmed Niyazi was famous for having a lucky deer. I've been trying to find a time to squeeze this little factoid in because it's just kind of hilarious. So here you go. During the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, Niyazi's band of deserters and Albanian guerrillas were apparently visited by a deer. And Niyazi and his troops basically took this as a sign from God, and they began to see the deer as a sort of spiritual guide. So, following the revolution, Niyazi and his band would travel around with this deer. And this is why, when you look up pictures of Niyazi, you will often see this deer randomly standing next to Niyazi. That is his lucky deer. So, on April the 16th, 1909, the Action Army, under Mahmud Shevket, Ahmed Niyazi, and the Lucky Deer, departed Salonica and began marching towards Istanbul at the head of a force of some 8,000 regular soldiers. The Action Army would include some very important future leaders of the late Ottoman Empire, including the future triumvirs Ahmed Cemal, who would actually serve as the chief of staff for Mahmud Shevket, and Ismail Enver, who had been in Berlin when the counter-revolution broke out, but Enver would, in true Enver style, quickly rush home and immediately throw himself into the center of action. And then Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, was also a part of the Action Army. Though I should note that I have seen the role of Chief of Staff to Mahmud Shevket be attributed to Mustafa Kemal. But according to Andrew Mango's biography of Ataturk, which, by the way, is a great resource if you want a balanced account of the life of Ataturk, but Mustafa Kemal was actually the chief of staff for a different commander who ranked below Mahmud Shevket, which meant that, yet again, Mustafa Kemal was overshadowed within the Action Army by other young officers like Cemal, who was actually Mahmud Shevket's chief of staff, as well as by Ismail Enver and Ahmed Niyazi. So, the Action Army under Mahmud Shevket would march through Macedonia, Monastir, Albania, and Thrace, passing through the towns and cities where less than a year earlier the CUP had launched their revolution. And as they went, General Shevket and his army gathered more and more volunteers. And from that initial nucleus of around 8,000 soldiers who began in Salonica, the Action Army would end up numbering some 25,000 fighters, meaning that a lot of people volunteered to fight with the Action Army as they passed through their towns or villages. The largest majority of these volunteers by far were Albanian, and this swelling of the ranks by Albanian volunteers would make the Action Army majority Albanian, as it is estimated that over 8,000, some estimates put it at over 10,000 Albanians, would join the Action Army, most being volunteers and guerrillas, though there were many Albanian soldiers as well. In general, the Action Army was quite diverse, and along with having a large contingent of Albanians, the army would also include some 6,000 to 7,000 Turks, most of whom were soldiers, as well as around 4,000 Macedo-Bulgarians, some 2,000 Greeks, and around 700 Jews. One of the final stops for the Action Army on its way to the imperial capital was the city of Edirne, where Mahmud Shevket's force would get another critical boost when thousands more local troops from the Second Army defected and joined up with their comrades in the Third Army. This last-minute defection of troops from the Second Army would give Mahmud Shevket more trained soldiers. This addition would bring the force to its final number of some 25,000 troops. This huge multi-ethnic army, making its way across the Balkans and towards Istanbul, symbolically represented the will of Ottoman Europe, with all its messy diversity, imposing itself on the traditionally entrenched powers of the imperial capital, as Turks, Albanians, Bulgarians, Armenians, Bosniaks, Pomaks, Jews, Greeks, and even a handful of Arabs marched side by side in the name of saving the Constitution and in the name of Ottomanism. General Mahmud Shevket, Ahmed Niyazi, Ismail Enver, Ahmed Cemal, and the rest of the 25,000-strong Action Army, in all its multi-ethnic glory, would, on April the 22nd, reach San Stefano, that suburb of Istanbul where Talat was busy putting together his National Assembly. At first, Mahmud Shevket would claim that he was marching on the capital simply in order to save Sultan Abdulhamid from the clutches of the reactionary mob. So it seemed for a brief moment that the Action Army might strike a tone of reconciliation and amnesty. But this would not last very long at all, as Talat was busy pushing the 100 or so deputies in his National Assembly to depose Sultan Abdulhamid once and for all, and to ruthlessly punish the enemies of the Constitution. And radical Unionist officers in the Action Army, like Enver and Cemal, were taking a similarly hawkish stance and calling for a full-on assault on the mutinous troops and reactionary students currently occupying the capital. In the end, those pushing for a firm hand would win out. And just a day after their arrival at the suburb of San Stefano, on April the 23rd, the Action Army under Mahmud Shevket would march on Istanbul. Commanding a far superior force to those who had risen up during the 31 March incident, the divisions of the Action Army quickly fanned out across the capital, engaging mutinous troops in street battles and storming buildings where the counter-revolutionaries were holed up. One of the most dramatic of these street battles would take place in Taksim Square, which is in the heart of Istanbul and which had been occupied by a throng of reactionary soldiers. The Action Army division who would attack Taksim would be led by none other than the hero of liberty, Ismail Enver, who, like I said, had characteristically thrown himself right into the thick of things upon his arrival from Berlin. During the skirmish, Enver led an attack against the army barracks at Taksim Square, which had become one of the primary strongholds for the counter-revolutionary soldiers. And after some fierce street fighting, Enver successfully stormed the Taksim barracks. And this daring raid would add to Enver's growing reputation as an intrepid military leader. A few other skirmishes and street battles would also take place in Istanbul between April the 24th and April the 27th. However, like I said, the Action Army had a far superior force, and it became pretty clear pretty fast that the counter-revolutionaries didn't really stand a chance against Mahmud Shevket and the might of the Second and Third Armies, together with their thousands of volunteers and guerrillas. And after the smoke had cleared and the last of the mutinous troops and reactionary soldiers had been rooted out, Mahmud Shevket would declare martial law in Istanbul, and summary executions were carried out against the primary conspirators of the 31 March incident. Among those executed would be the reactionary Naqshbandi sheikh, Dervish Vadeti, whose populist brand of Islam had been a precipitating factor in the insurrection. And likely having in mind Vadeti's inflammatory newspaper Volkan, which had been critical in spreading counter-revolutionary propaganda leading up to the mutiny in the First Army, Mahmud Shevket, together with the CUP, would immediately implement new restrictions on the press. Shevket would also enforce a curfew and just generally begin to suspend the civil liberties of the residents in Istanbul as order was being restored. And even though these were all temporary measures, the martial law enforced following the 31 March incident would ominously foreshadow the authoritarian policies of the CUP and later the Kemalists in the coming decades. After Mahmud Shevket had occupied Istanbul and established martial law, Talat National Assembly moved back to the parliament building at Sirigan Palace, and a larger parliament would then be convened in order to discuss how best to move forward. And it would be during this emergency session of parliament when Mehmed Talat would really begin to establish himself as a dominant figure in government. Ever since he put together his National Assembly in San Stefano during the dark days of the counter-revolution, Talat had been pushing hard to get rid of Sultan Abdulhamid once and for all. So once the full parliament convened on April the 27th, Talat had already convinced the 100 or so deputies who had joined him in the National Assembly to depose the Sultan. And then during the 31 March incident, many of the lives of the parliamentary deputies had been directly threatened by the reactionary mob who went around trying to lynch the enemies of the Sultan. So with this recently terrifying episode in mind, it was not all that hard for Talat to convince the rest of Parliament that some sort of radical action did now need to be taken. But what exactly that action would entail was a matter of debate. The Parliament briefly entertained the idea of possibly executing Abdulhamid. But this option was pretty quickly thrown out due to that recently terrifying episode and the general fear amongst the deputies that executing the Sultan might conjure up the fanatical elements of society to rise up en masse and plunge the empire into a full-blown civil war. But even though execution was viewed as too dangerous, almost all of the deputies agreed that it would now be impossible to work with Sultan Abdulhamid after all that had happened. Because even though Abdulhamid had not played any direct role in the counter-revolution, the insurrectionaries had absolutely risen up in defense of his rule. So deputies in parliament feared, rightly, that Abdulhamid would be able to snatch back his autocratic rule through wielding the power of the reactionary mobs of Istanbul. So there was a general consensus that the best option would be to depose and exile Abdulhamid. But there was one final sticking point. Due to the intricacies of Islamic law, an imperial fatwa, or a legal opinion given by leaders of the ulama, religious scholars, needed to be issued in order to justify and fully legalize the deposition of Sultan Abdulhamid. So, the deputies brought a prominent member of the ulama into parliament to discuss. This scholar would initially hesitate to depose his sultan caliph, but after some good old-fashioned bullying, the deputies, led by Talat, would secure their imperial fatwa. And this decree from the ulama would officially declare that Sultan Abdulhamid was guilty of crimes committed against the Ottoman people and the broader Islamic community. After receiving this imperial fatwa, the parliament then took a vote on whether or not to depose the sultan. The decision would end up being unanimously in favor of deposition. And so, under the leadership of Mehmed Talat, the Ottoman parliament, with a fatwa in hand, would officially depose Sultan Abdulhamid on April the 27th, 1909. So, you heard that right, boys and girls. Abdulhamid, the Red Sultan, the consummate political survivor who has been with us this entire season, is finally leaving our story. Get him out of here. I promise this is not some gotcha moment. This really will be the end of Abdulhamid, the man who managed to cling onto power for over 3 decades amidst some of the most tumultuous years in the history of the Ottoman Empire, and who had this uncanny ability to just slide through one crisis after another, always weaseling along. That man is finally gone. The Red Sultan is no more. Abdulhamid, who through his repressive and murderous policies did more than anyone else to unite the opposition movement of Young Turks leading up to the revolution, is no longer going to play any significant role in our story moving forward. So let's just take a brief moment of silence to appreciate this momentous event. What can we say about Sultan Abdulhamid? Probably no other sultan of the Ottoman Empire is as controversial as Abdulhamid. Was he a paranoid maniac who constructed an ever-present secret police that stomped all over people's rights and arbitrarily arrested, exiled, and executed political enemies? Or was he one of the great political tacticians who navigated the treacherous world of Ottoman politics when countless forces were constantly lined up against him? Or was he a mass murderer who oversaw the organized massacre of hundreds of thousands of his Christian subjects? Or perhaps he was a masterful diplomat who held an adroit understanding of international affairs and who skillfully played the great powers off of one another for decades as his empire continued to just trudge along, even though the European imperialists and Balkan nationalists were always planning the empire's final demise? Well, of course, the answer to all of these questions is yes. Abdulhamid was all of these things. Paranoid maniac, political tactician, mass murderer, masterful diplomat. And now he is gone. and the CUP and other leaders of the Ottoman government would now have to adjust to not having a sworn enemy to unite them and to blame all of their problems on. Once Abdulhamid was deposed, the CUP would not be able to resist one final slight to the Sultan's honor, as they would exile Abdulhamid to none other than Salonica. So that's right, the Sultan would be forced to move to the city that gave birth to the CUP and to the revolution that had ended his reign. Abdulhamid would spend the next several years of his life under house arrest in the house of a prominent Sephardic Jewish businessman, living in a mansion just across town from the Sacred Committee, who would continue to keep a careful eye on the old fart, just in case he might try and start scheming his way back into power once more. But this is an official sayonara to Sultan Abdulhamid. Good riddance. The delegation who had communicated the decision of Parliament to depose the Sultan was a strikingly diverse group and included Turks as well as several Albanians and an Armenian and a Jew. Though this represented the ethnic makeup of the Action Army who had just reinstated the Constitution by force, the presence of non-Muslims within this delegation was viewed as an affront by many pious Muslims. This was because Abdulhamid had not only been the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, but he had also been the Caliph, or spiritual leader of the entire Islamic world. And this controversy over the parliamentary delegation would foreshadow future tensions, because now that the CUP and Parliament were back in power, they would set out to more firmly establish a secularized empire. And even though it was pretty obvious that liberal deputies had played a significant role in the counter-revolution, Mahmud Shevket's government and powerful CUP leaders would place the entirety of the blame for the 31 March incident squarely on quote-unquote reactionaries, who were quickly emerging as the number one boogeyman of the revolution. What the CUP meant by reactionaries were Islamists, religious conservatives, and other pious Muslims, though this term reactionaries would gradually begin to be deployed against all enemies of the government more generally, whether they were actually conservative or not. The weaponized use of the term reactionaries would persist well into the CUP's dictatorship, and beyond into the Republican era under Mustafa Kemal. The man who would replace Abdulhamid as Sultan was Abdulhamid's half-brother, Mehmed Reshad, who would be proclaimed Mehmed V on April the 27th. Mehmed Reshad had spent most of his life living in that weird, luxurious house arrest so unique to the Ottoman system, which had a long tradition of forcing future sultans to live in near-complete isolation in order to prevent the emergence of rival claimants to the throne. And then, in the immediate aftermath of the July 1908 revolution, Mehmed Reshad had taken advantage of the increased freedoms to leave his isolation and to attend constitutionalist balls and to generally endear himself to the Young Turks. What this means is that Mehmed Reshad would, as a weak-willed friend of the Young Turks, largely act as a figurehead sultan, and he would wield very little real power, allowing Parliament, the Sublime Porte bureaucracy, and the CUP to govern the empire. And moving into May 1909, these would be the three primary power centers in the empire who would jockey for position within Ottoman politics: Parliament, the Sublime Porte, and the CUP. But at this specific moment in the aftermath of the Action Army's occupation of Istanbul, the CUP was clearly ascendant, as they had proven themselves yet again to be the only ones capable of defending the Constitution from the forces of reaction. Two Unionists in particular would emerge as uniquely powerful within the new government. First was Mehmed Javid,
the Donme economist from Salonica, who would be appointed as Minister of Finance. And then, of course, there was Javid's comrade from Salonica, revolutionary mailman turned parliamentary strongman Mehmed Talat, who would be appointed interior minister. This meant that Talat and Javid were now both members of all three of these institutions jockeying for power, as they were both influential members of the CUP Sacred Committee, both were powerful deputies in parliament, and now both also held top-tier positions within the government ministry. But perhaps even more powerful than Talat and Javid in the months and years directly following the counter-revolution would be General Mahmud Shevket, the unquestioned leader of the Action Army who had just triumphantly marched into the imperial capital. Following this conquest, Mahmud Shevket would be appointed as the martial law commander of the city, which would give the general unrivaled power in Istanbul. And then, on top of being given the task of maintaining law and order in the capital, Mahmud Shevket was also appointed as Minister of War, and he was tapped to be the inspector of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd armies. So, Mahmud Shevket now effectively governed Istanbul and controlled the entire army, as most troops were, for now, loyal to their commander. On top of this, even though Mahmud Shevket was not an official member of the CUP, he was viewed by the Unionists and other young Turks as an ally. So he had the blessing of the CUP. That is all to say that Mahmud Shevket was undoubtedly the man of the hour following the counter-revolution. The events of April 1909 would be hugely influential on the future course of the Ottoman Empire. And broadly speaking, the occupation of Istanbul by the Action Army would represent a major turning point in the revolutionary project of the CUP and of the so-called Young Turks more generally. And if we were to boil this turning point down to one single, slightly oversimplified phrase, we would say that this moment marks the pinnacle of Ottomanism as an ideological program. Because, as we have noted, the Action Army was an incredibly diverse force, made up of troops coming from a wide range of religious and ethnic backgrounds. The most important groups within the Action Army were Albanians, Turks, Macedo-Bulgarians, Armenians, and Jews. And this multi-ethnic army marched from Salonica, a city known for being on the cutting edge of modernity, politically and economically, and they would conquer Istanbul, the traditional seat of entrenched autocratic power. The Action Army in this way represented the dream of forging a multicultural, supranational constitutional monarchy, in which the many different peoples of the Ottoman Empire could come together and unite in their shared patriotism and love of liberty. But as these things so often go, the height of anything is usually followed by an epic collapse. And as we will see, Ottomanism will quickly begin to bend and crack and twitch and eventually just completely fall apart into a hideous, stinking garbage pile underneath the weight of its own internal contradictions. Because if we were to peek ahead just a little bit at what is in store for us over the next few years, oh boy, what we would see is widespread internal revolt and near constant external war. And the way that Mahmud Shevket and the CUP are going to respond to these threats is through centralizing the government and generally becoming more authoritarian, especially when it comes to ruling the diverse ethnic communities living in the peripheral territories of their empire. And since the men now ruling the empire were people like General Mahmud Shevket and other Mektebli officers schooled in German-style modernization, a la Vandergoltz, the institution that the new government would deploy against the rebellious elements out in their peripheral territories would be, wait for it, the military. And so, April 1909 marks both the height of Ottomanism and the true arrival of militarism into Ottoman politics and governance. The intervention of the Action Army in April 1909 represented one of the first major instances of direct military involvement in imperial politics since the Tanzimat era. And this would end up setting a pretty dangerous precedent, as the military would now act as the protectors of the constitutional order, and they would sit above civilian institutions. It would be within this new environment that an increasing number of educated Mektebli officers, schooled in German-style militarism, would begin to rise to prominence, with the most visible examples being Ahmed Cemal, and then, of course, Ismail Enver. So, from now on, the Ottoman Empire would follow the great powers and their Balkan neighbors in the great project of becoming a nation in arms. In next episode, we will begin to see why the decline of Ottomanism would be intimately intertwined with this rise in militarism. Because the new CUP-led government would begin to appoint Mektebli military officers to fill government posts out in the provinces that were previously filled by civilians. And as the CUP tries to use these officers to pursue their authoritarian policies to centralize the government, they would begin to piss a lot of people off. And in the end, the unraveling of Ottomanism would at first center around the disillusionment of two groups who had, up to this point, been integral components within the Ottomanist project and critical to the success of the CUP's revolution. These two groups are the Armenians and the Albanians. So, next episode, we'll begin in southern Anatolia, in that all-important region of Cilicia, where amidst the chaos of the counter-revolution and counter-revolution, tens of thousands of Armenians would be massacred by reactionaries in a widespread pogrom in the city of Adana. The Adana massacre would deal yet another catastrophic blow to the Armenian community of the Ottoman Empire, and the massacre would severely strain the relations between the Armenians and the Young Turks in the CUP. And then our next episode will end all the way over on the other side of the empire in Kosovo, where the first flames of a true Albanian independence movement were beginning to flicker, in direct reaction to the CUP's authoritarian turn. And it would be the revolts amongst the Albanians, more than really anything else, that would spell the end of Ottomanism as a workable program. Because Albanians had been at the head of the revolutionary movement, with Albanian leaders like Ahmed Niyazi being some of the most important figures in the 1908 revolution, and with Albanians forming the majority of the Action Army. In short, the Albanians had been one of the most critical elements in the revolutionary coalition of 1908 and 1909. And the growing disillusionment of Albanian leaders with the CUP's centralizing policies would begin to unravel this revolutionary coalition. So, next episode, we will move from 1909 to 1910 and travel down to Adana and then over to Kosovo, where we will find Armenians under fire, Albanians in revolt.